Get started. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today is the next session in our series with CDS, the folks from the University of Delaware. And today we will be continuing the conversation around MTSS. And with me, I have Mackenzie Shane. I will let him introduce himself. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. And hopefully, more people filter in, but if not, welcome. Appreciate it. So my name is Mackenzie Shane, and I work at the Delaware MTSS Technical Assistance Center, um, primarily working with IEPs. And I'm joined by several members of my team, some who will probably stay muted and some who may not. But if everybody who's on our team, if you want to just give a wave in the camera, that way we know. Awesome. Okay. And so with that, you know what, Liz, I'm not gonna make believe like we're presenting to a big audience when it's just really you right now. So why don't you tell
Like
us a little
someone
bit about.
else joined. There is someone else on here too. Someone else joined.
Oh, it's perfect. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Well, since we're a small group, do you mind if we just like briefly either unmute or in the chat, whatever your preferred modality is, if we can just share kind of who you are, where you're from, what you do?
So I'm Liz Mays. I work in the Red Clay School District now with Autism Services. I worked previously in the Christina School District with Autism Services. And there's a lot of crossover between my students and students with social emotional needs. And so I'm trying to better learn. That's why I'm here.
Love that. Awesome. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, I'm Larissa. I'm a parent of a child with IEP for ADHD and some other kind of emotional issues, but just wanted to sit in and listen and see if there's anything I could pick up to use here at my home.
Love that. Well, Larissa and Liz, thank you for joining us. I'm hoping that, hearing from you, it sounds like there's going to be some good takeaways from this presentation, and I'm hopeful that that'll be the case. But this will be relatively informal in the sense that, we're a small audience. And so if there are opportunities that you want to unmute, ask questions, or seek additional clarification, please feel free to. All right.
All right, thanks.
Yep. Okay, so what we're going to do is briefly look at the professional learning standards that we adhere to. They are developed from Learning Forward. Typically, we will reside in this area. It's implementation, which is part of our transformational processes, in which we talk about how educators and professional learning in general is going to be equitable and result in outcomes, beneficial outcomes for students. So I'm going to turn now to our working agreements. These are just general agreements that we typically like to establish at the beginning of our meetings, norms that we'd like to look at. So if you want to look at this super quick, find one that's resonating with you today, that you'd like to ground yourself in. I'll just give a moment for you to read them and ground yourself in that. All right. And so the driving questions that we're going to tackle today, number one is we're going to talk about what kinds of data do schools use to make instructional decisions. Number two, how do grade level standards and competencies drive instruction? So what does that look like? And then number three, what are the Delaware SEL competencies and how do they influence instruction? So we're going to kind of hit this from a few different perspectives. We're going to establish that common language first. We're going to talk about grade level standards and competencies and their influence on instruction second. And we're going to talk about SEL specific competencies and how they specifically influence instruction. So driving question number one, we're going to kick it right off with what kind of data or kinds of data, if we're not using data as plural in this, do schools use to make instructional decisions? So typically, whenever we are considering data, we want to use and frame it from a database decision-making process. We want to use data to influence what the actions are that we are taking that are going to then result in these preferred outcomes for our students. And what that really starts with is a gathering process. We want to gather that data before we can begin interpreting it. We want to make sure that we're kind of mapping out what it is that we're looking at in terms of what are the data sources, what are they telling us, before we talk about how that's going to influence our assumptions, our beliefs, our actions, and our practices. Once we've gathered the data, then we want to talk about how we're going to interpret that data. So how are we climbing that ladder of inference and considering how it is that we want to interpret that data? Then we make decisions based off that, we evaluate those decisions, and we revise decisions as needed. This is not something that is specific to schools. I would say that we use data-based decision-making processes in our everyday life. If you've ever kept a household budget, this is an example of a data-based decision-making process where you take your present level of spending and your present income, you compare them to each other, and then you talk about, if you're talking with somebody about that, what you can do to change it to a more preferred outcome, right? We do this in exercise. We do this in a variety of different domains, but this is specific to schools in this case, where we're taking that data, we're acting on that data, we're evaluating the results of that data. So this happens in what we call a multi-tiered system of support. And there are specific services that have kind of similar structures within this process. So MTSS, if you're not familiar with it, is the premise that we are supporting students across a number of different what we call tiers and in a number of different capacities to really, at the end of the day, support the whole child. We want to make sure that there's a comprehensive team, assessment group, strategy development process that is surrounding each and every learner. And so within that, we're going to have different assessment methods, intervention decisions in the spirit of that whole child approach, what we call an individualized learning process, which is framed in a couple different ways, but we're really going to talk about, again, how that contributes to really our preferred outcomes for social emotional learning for students in this presentation. We talked a little bit about this already. We've talked about the data sources, and so a lot of those are going to come from different assessments that are run. When we talk about assessments, it's not just tests and quizzes that we talk about, but it's also what we call formative feedback opportunities, which are just different opportunities for us to quick gather data. Sometimes that data is going to look different. That might be part of a universal screening process, which I know my colleague Nikki Kendall talked about in a previous session about what that universal screening process looks like. Again, that's not a one-off decision, but a part of a series of different processes that are intended to look at what general practices are and see where needs are most highlighted. The diagnostic processes are a little bit different in the sense that they kind of inform during the process what are the specific skills and areas that we might need to focus on for our learners. And then we've also got our progress monitoring measure. We're doing a thing. How do we know that that thing is doing what we're intending it to do? If it is, fantastic. What are the decisions that we're making based off of that? If it's not, what do we maybe need to do differently, either in the process or the context around it, to be able to make sure that we're getting to what we want to get through in this process? So as you can see, it's highlighted here in this bottom right-hand corner of this graphic. It's a delightful graphic. There's a lot to unpack in it, but we're really kind of focused in that area right there, the comprehensive assessment system in this. All right. So really quickly, we're going to dovetail into driving question number 2, because I think that this really effectively frames the conversation that we just had and kind of the point of it. It's a lot of information that was just thrown at you. We're really going to focus in on how do grade level standards and competencies drive instruction. And so if you talk to anybody on my team, on our team in this room, they know how much time we spend on talking about standards and competencies, because they really are the distinct statements about what students should know and be able to do. They're going to provide different building blocks for instruction, right? So in addition to kind of that threshold, we call it a threshold of proficiency, or kind of that overall ask of what it is that a student should be able to do. But on top of that, that typically builds on prior competencies and prior abilities and prior skills. And so they serve both as kind of that overall ask in a specific snapshot in time, but also for the building blocks that we are going to be constructing on top of that, as any standards and competencies do. We know how different academic tasks change from grade to grade. They increase in complexity, they increase in their asks. And so what it is that we are doing in this is very similar. And we'll talk a little bit more about that once we get to the SEL standards and proficiencies. And I think the biggest thing that surrounds this is that regardless of what curriculum or assessment tool you're talking about, the standards and competencies are essentially a standalone. Again, it's kind of that snapshot in time, that threshold of proficiency. What is it that I want a student to be able to do in a specific domain for a specific grade at a specific point in time? And so it's really beneficial because regardless of the curriculum that you're using, although most of the curriculum out there, especially the math and science curriculum, Common Core state standards have been around for a while, they're going to already have those standards embedded in that curriculum in terms of how it is that they're asking students to hit them. But what you may not know is that there are standards and competencies across different domains in the state of Delaware, and that these are commonly agreed upon by the Delaware Department of Education. We talked a little bit about ELA and math with the Common Core state standards, but there are also standards for students who are receiving a Diploma of Alternate Achievement standards. We use the Dynamic Learning Maps Consortium and the essential elements for English, language arts, math, and science for those students. For students who are receiving a regular diploma in science, we have the NGSS, the Next Generation Science Standards. Social Studies has the Delaware State Standards for Social Studies. We have the Social Emotional Behavioral Learning Competencies here at the bottom. And the list goes on. We've got World Language Competencies, Multilingual Learning Competencies, Health and Physical Education, Financial Literacy, Visual and Performing Arts. Again, the list goes on. But the point is, I think, about this is that the competencies, the thresholds for proficiency, the standards that we are looking for are really embedded throughout this process, and we can do it across a number of different domains, depending on what, again, class the student is in and what we're specifically looking for from that student. And I think something that is really important for us to frame in this conversation is that standards represent end-of-year expectations for that grade level. So when we are considering, for example, an IEP goal, that may not necessarily, the IEP timeframe may not necessarily line up from beginning of year to end of year. And so the end of year ask for like an IEP, for example, may not necessarily be at the end of the IEP, so to speak. And so there may be different kind of ways that that is chopped up based on what it is, where your annual meeting timing is compared to the rest of the year. But when we're talking about standards and kind of how it is that students are showing what they know with these standards and competencies, that the end of year is really kind of where that that expectation of proficiency kind of falls for our learners. I wanted to take a moment to kind of pause super quick and see if there was anything that was either resonating, any questions that you might have, comments, before we move on to specifics about what SEL competencies look like. No?
Nope, nothing for me.
Awesome. All right. So we're going to keep it moving. And I think this is the part where the rubber really hits the road with regards to kind of this whole conversation of what do SEL competencies inform in this process? So exactly that driving question, what are they? How do they influence instruction? So let's talk about the origin of them super quick. So the social emotional learning process in 2018, there was basically a diagnostic or root cause analysis process that was summarized in this article, A Broader Vision of School Success, Insights and Opportunities for Social Emotional Learning in Delaware. This is a partnership of these organizations over here. University of Delaware, our own Debbie Boyer was involved in this process as well. But the purpose of this research study was to make recommendations to bring Delaware to a place where all students receive emotional, social, and academic supports that they need, and all in conjunction with one another. So in light of that process, what we really kind of fell into were these 6 categories that broke down what the social emotional learning process might look like. And so these following categories, we have equity, collaboration, engagement, shared leadership, capacity, and balanced measurement. And these were kind of the 6 pillars that helped to inform what type of social emotional learning we were pushing out as a state, and how we were targeting specific groups to ensure, again, that, and I invite you to read the article. I think it's about 100 pages. So I just really wanted to bring the highest possible level interpretation from it, because I think it's important to contextualize this historically. But the place that we're going to focus in on specifically is engagement, and engagement with parents and LEAs. And that's what we're doing today, is having that conversation about how can we bring this home, right? How can we bring this to parents in a way that's meaningful, that we can talk about both what the support structure might look like at home and how they can have these conversations and frame these conversations at school. So focusing in on that engagement area, outreach to parents and LEAs, that's where this specific work came from. And so this is the language from that. I'm going to give you a second to connect with that language. I don't want to read it off the slide to you. And as you're reading, and I'm going to invite the entire group, what words are standing out to you? What are you connecting with? You can either unmute yourself or put it in the chat. And remember, this is 2018, so these findings are at this point now 6 years old, but sometimes they feel timeless, don't they?
Struggle is the big word that comes out to me.
Do you want to talk more about that, Liz?
It is. It's a struggle to, I think, effectively get everybody. It's hard to get everybody on the school side just together for things, and then you have to reach out to the parents, and you have to. I mean, I span different schools, so my hours aren't the same. But there are parents, that work certain hours and they can't attend meetings during certain days, and it really does cause, I think, a rift sometimes between the school and the family, a little bit of a back and forth in that. And it's unfortunate, we have a lot on our plate as educators, and the families have a lot on their plate too. It's just those hours of the day, they don't always work out right. And I think, so not only is it just a struggle of something to deal with in general, but then it compounds itself and it gets worse as it goes on.
I agree. And that time equity that you talked about, it's not something that anybody has a surplus of these days. Thanks for sharing that. Engagement and critical. Yep, absolutely. So the concept of family and student engagement being so critical to this. This is going to be something that is, again, a bridge across, I think, what Liz was describing, kind of that common language between families and educators, that sometimes there's things that just get lost in the sauce. And so as we're having those conversations, how are we doing it and ensuring that it's equitable and that's coming from an asset and strengths-based perspective? That's awesome. Anybody else? I'm going to welcome anybody who's just joined. We have, we're presenting right now, but it's a small group. So if you feel comfortable engaging, we're in the process of just either chatting or unmuting, but we're just talking about things that are resonating with this slide. Don't feel obligated to do any of that, though. Awesome. So again, the goal in this process, we're looking to bridge that gap. We want to engage students and families. We really want to hear from those stakeholders how it is both that they can support what is being developed in school and how what they are saying is influencing what's happening in schools. So we're going to move on quickly to the Delaware SEL competencies structure. So when we talk about competencies, there are 5 primary areas that we're going to be considering today. Those are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. And so these are sorted into specific benchmarks and performance indicators. So each of these is going to have a benchmark that accompanies it, and then it's going to have specific performance indicators that are sorted into grade bands. So K to 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 8, and 9 through 12. This is relatively consistent with a lot of the Common Core state standard structures that you'll see out there. They may be called different things, but typically these categories are then split into subcategories, and then there's specific indicators. And the specific indicators are typically what we refer to as the standards, or as we were talking about them earlier, those thresholds for proficiency. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of these as we move throughout this presentation. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to unmute or drop into the chat. We appreciate the any feedback you're able to give throughout the presentation. So we want to pivot quickly to how we can support SEL growth at home, knowing that those categories, and I'm going to go back super quickly, of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making are what we're task prioritizing in this case. I want to talk about some specific ways that we can support SEL growth at home in consistent ways. And you're going to see, we're going to go through each of these categories. We're going to highlight maybe chronologically each of them. The first indicator is kind of the structure that we've chosen for today. But a lot of the ways that we're going to kind of bring them home are going to fall into each of these specific categories. So I'm going to spend some time on each of them, if you don't mind. So if we start with modeling behavior, parents can model positive social and emotional behaviors at home in a variety of ways. Active listening, empathy, modeling that problem-solving process. There are so many different ways that modeling behavior, what we tend to call in the classroom the we do process. There's what we call the gradual release process. There's I do as the teacher, we do together, and then you do as we release independently. And so that modeling behavior really starts to kind of spark that we do process where students are starting to internalize a lot of those structures. We also have open communication. If you're able to encourage open communication at home where students feel comfortable expressing their thoughts and emotions, setting goals, and helping your students, your children set, monitor, and adapt their own goals for personal growth and success. Building support networks where we might be able to assist students in identifying positive role models and support systems, both within their own families and within the communities, helping bring about a sense of belonging and also a sense of resilience, because there may be kind of trial by error process in that as well. And that's really what we're looking to foster in this whole process. I think kind of underscores the entire thing is the concept of resilience and how we're looking to build that in our students. Problem solving skills, they almost speak for themselves, how it is that they're able to identify problems, brainstorm solutions, make decisions. A sense of cultural awareness, how it is that we are able to promote awareness and respect for cultural differences at home, and what does diversity and inclusion look like for students, how we can develop empathy and understanding towards others in a variety of what those others might look like and sound like, and encouraging self-care. What does that look like with regards to mindfulness, relaxation, healthy coping strategies, dealing effectively with stress, dealing in a healthy way with stress, and then conflict resolution. So what does conflict resolution look like in terms of identifying what a conflict is, expressing feelings in a constructive way, listening actively to others, working towards mutually beneficial solutions, knowing that conflicts don't arise necessarily as a result of, a values statement about the relationship, but rather are just natural occurrences, and that we as just human beings have to be adept in navigating them. So these are all kind of the different buckets of different suggestions that we'll be giving throughout this process. But we're really hopeful that, this is not only going to support your understanding of SEL competencies in how students can demonstrate them, but also support different ways that we can just widely support one another in these communities that we have. So we're going to start with self-awareness, the specific competency of self-awareness. We have 5 different benchmarks here. So I'm going to give you a second to connect with those benchmarks, these self-awareness benchmarks. And it's important, I think, to indicate that self-awareness is the first competency. I don't think by accident. A lot of times what you'll find is that when we're talking about students being able to regulate themselves, a lot of times the first question really comes down to, is there an understanding of what that emotion is, or what that behavior is, or what that communication is, right? And so that mutual understanding of self, of what it is that is happening, I think is really it's important to know that I think that's one of the first processes that an educator engages in when they're looking to build a specific skill set. And so I think that's where we are with this. So each of these 5 competencies are super important. We're really only going to have time to unpack one of them. So this first one, 1A, is what can we do to support students in demonstrating an awareness of one's own emotions? So when it comes to those, we're going to consider, okay, so what does an awareness of one's emotions look like, and how can we support that process at home? So again, what does it look like, and what does it help students do? So students may be able to, as a result of demonstrating proficiency in self-awareness, they may understand causes of feelings, right? They may be able to label and identify emotions accurately. They may recognize how emotions influence their behavior, and that's super important. In terms of how parents can help, I think there's also a number of different opportunities here. There's opportunities perhaps to discuss emotions openly. Remember, going back to those open conversations that we may be having with one another or with our students. How we can model emotional expressions and how we can have safe spaces for talks about feelings. So these are different ways, again, these different outcomes that we're looking for our students, but then also how we can best support these outcomes. I want to ask to anybody who's in here, and you can again unmute yourself or put it in the chat. Are there different things that you can think of that may support either self-awareness at home, maybe a strategy to support self-awareness at home, or different ways or methods that you think teaching to this specific competency might support a student in being able to do something? Basic question is, anything else you would add to this slide? And the best part is, even if there's nothing explicit to add to this slide now, I really do feel like, again, the SEL competencies build one on top of another. And so what you may see now versus what you may see later is, or maybe a little bit different. And so I'm excited to kind of see how this impacts this. So the second area that we want to focus in on right now is self-management. So what does student self-management look like? And it's broken down into only 2 specific benchmark areas that we have with this. The ability to understand and use strategies for managing one's own emotions and behaviors constructively, and then setting, monitoring, adapting, and evaluating one's own goals to achieve success in school and in life. It's really interesting because if you think about 2B and the actions that are taking place in this, they're remarkably similar to the database decision-making process that we talked about earlier, right? And so again, I think you'll see that that research base is pretty aligned throughout this process of, this is how we want to consider what it is that we're doing with students. So again, it's the understanding and using strategies for managing emotions and behaviors, and then the goal setting, and then follow through process, the database decision-making process with self-management, that metacognition that goes into that. So we're going to talk about 2A in this, the understanding and using strategies for managing one's own emotions and behaviors constructively. So again, it's going to be the same questions. What does it look like, and what does it help students do? Helps them identify strategies to calm themselves when upset. That's super important. Again, when we are supporting our students it's so important for us to be able to support them in self-recognizing when there may be something developing that we may want to signal and say, hey, this may be a good opportunity to leverage some of those self-management techniques or those coping mechanisms that we've been working on together. Maybe maintaining emotional balance, right? Again, we kind of consider those proactive SEL strategies as supporting, again, in different ways. I kind of relate it to watering a plant. You don't necessarily want to start watering a plant by the time it turns brown. It's probably not the best time to just dump a whole bunch of water on it. But how are we kind of consistently keeping that plant alive through the process? I feel challenged in this metaphor because Bryn is an office mate of mine, and she knows that I have let all of the plants die in our office. And so I have let most of the plants die in this office. We may still have more. But again, we want to make sure that we are watering these plants proactively to ensure that we're not just dumping a whole bunch of water on them as triage in this metaphor. We want to support them in maintaining that emotional balance. And then we want to help them develop, again, there's that word resilience and coping skills. How is it that they're going to be able to demonstrate that resilience to fight through problems that they feel resourced and skilled enough to be able to fight through? And again, how can parents help? Again, we can encourage that goal setting and celebration of progress, especially with 2B. I think that that's huge. And then finding those specific moments to celebrate in those different languages to be able to celebrate with them, and those shared opportunities for that. Modeling calming strategies. This is huge because we have different opportunities that we may get frustrated on our day-to-day, whether it's in traffic or a phone call that you weren't expecting, or just something that takes some of your time that you weren't expecting. But being able to co-model those calming strategies is super important, and to be able to name those things when you're doing them with your student, with your child, with your learner. And then providing an environment that supports self-regulation. And I think this one is crucial because it's one thing to, model that and to show what those opportunities are, but you also want to make sure that you're observing the environment around your learner as well, around your child, around your student as well, and asking those questions of is this a place where, I feel comfortable self-regulating, where my child might feel comfortable self-regulating? And if so, that's fantastic, and consider different ways that you can apply that to other places. If not, consider what are different ways that you can maybe remove some of those extraneous things that are making it not a great self-regulatory space. Let's revisit this. I want to give maybe just a second to anybody. I know we didn't get much the last one, but anything anybody would add to this? You can either put it in the chat or unmute yourself if you'd like.
Mac, the only thing that I would add to this is that we're human, and self-management is easier said than done. Like, we all screw up. So going back to the first one you reviewed, self-awareness, when we are not able to self-manage, going back to self-awareness and modeling the reflection, hey, you know what? I didn't handle that as well as I would have liked to. I struggled with managing my own emotions. I was stressed coming home from the office, and I don't think that I spoke to you as well as I could have, or whatever that is. And so having the self-awareness of yourself as a parent or as a teacher models being able to recover and showing your child, your student, that they're safe to screw up too, because we do things like that and it's okay. We don't ruin relationships over it.
No. And thanks for sharing that, Bryn. And I think that, again, 1C, we didn't get a chance to unpack that, but demonstrate an awareness of one's own strengths and opportunities for growth. The work of Carol Dweck underpins a lot of what we do with growth versus fixed mindset, and the fact that we are all growing throughout our natural lives. We're learning, we're doing different things better in different ways in a lot of instances. And so that capacity for growth is real. and something that is not just present for a child, but for you as a parent or you as an educator, regardless. I appreciate you bringing that up, Bryn. Sorry, I'm going all the way back. Anything else anybody would want to comment on this? And I think another thing to mention in this that supports this is that these proficiencies, they may come and go in varying ways. It's, you don't necessarily, we're not asking, I think that the previous terminology has and always has kind of been mastery. We've mastered this. Find me a person who has mastered self-management. These are remarkably ambiguous, distinct competencies that it changes, day to day, minute to minute, context by context. And so we cannot have that expectation of perfection of ourselves or of our students. That's probably something that will result in heartbreak along the way. And so I really want to maintain that, an expectation of all of these things all the time across all different contexts, I think might be unrealistic. And so we're looking for proficiency and those transferable, generalizable skills that can go from one place to the next. Social awareness is our next area. So 3A for this, demonstrating awareness and consideration of other people's emotions, perspectives, and social cues. 3B, exhibiting civic responsibility in multiple settings. And 3C, demonstrating an awareness of and respect for human dignity, including culture and differences. So the social awareness aspect kind of now, again, when we're talking about the build, we've built from self-awareness and self-management. We've internalized some of these concepts. Now we're in the process of applying them and looking outward instead of just inward, right? And so how is it that we're ensuring that our learners are looking outward, looking at their social settings and how it is that they're kind of, again, demonstrating these specific proficiencies? Place that we're going to focus on for this is 3A, the demonstration of awareness and consideration of other people's emotions, perspectives, and social cues. So again, what does it look like? What does it help them do? So the first thing that we may have in this process, and I think that one that is super helpful, especially considering, I think, societally where we are, what we lost a lot of during COVID was the implied ability to recognize and interpret facial expressions and body language. I don't want to say we lost that, but opportunities to practice were lost in terms of this shift to remote and hybrid, the wearing of masks, covering faces, and not really being able to detect what facial expressions were happening, knowing that those traditional social cues were kind of getting thrown up in the air to a certain degree. Students do carry some of those things with them. I know as adults, we carry those things with us. And so something that, explicit teaching in what facial expressions and body language may signify about both the other person who's listening and also the interaction that you're having is crucial in this. How it is that we're building and maintaining positive relationships. What is a relationship? What is a positive relationship? How do we engage in a reciprocal back and forth, meaningful relationship that, has maybe different forms and takes on different versions at different times and in different contexts? And then how do we resolve conflicts more effectively? We're going to run into conflict. We've talked about running into conflict. How is it that we're engaging in a conflict resolution process? Are we inadvertently burning bridges that we may not want to burn in terms of how it is that students are engaging with that conflict resolution and how it is that we're modeling that, which of course will come up when we talk about how can parents help. So some of the things that we can do, we can discuss social scenarios and appropriate responses. So that role playing, that opportunity to just talk about a situation as a whole. Hey, I saw that you were not feeling great when we were walking, through the grocery store, and you really wanted to buy that pack of gum at checkout. You seemed like, you were talking really loudly, and you seemed like you were upset. Do you think that that was accurate? Is that how you were feeling? They're naming that emotion. They're able to contextualize that. Do we feel, what do we feel about that? And taking those opportunities, and it may not necessarily be unpacking the specific situation that you have, with your child, with your student. I have a 7-year-old and 11-year-old, and I can tell you that every time I have those conversations in my head, it goes a lot worse in real life because feelings are still high about that. But being able to talk about other social situations and role playing specific outcomes is incredibly beneficial. Modeling respectful listening and perspective taking. So how is it that we are going to both listen to and in some instances adopt the perspectives of people that we may not necessarily always agree with? And so that's crucially important, is being able to kind of take that point of view outside of oneself. An incredibly difficult thing to do if not explicitly taught. And not really an assumption that it's an assumption that sometimes is varying ways misplaced about students' abilities to be able to do this. We always want to make sure that we are, again, offering those opportunities for students to think about how they might be able to engage with that perspective taking process. And then empathy goes along with this as well. How is it that we're able to encourage students to express empathy for others that may not necessarily share that viewpoint? Anything else that anybody would add to this? Social awareness is, again, the first kind of externalized competency that we're talking about instead of internalized. Any thoughts?
As educators, we totally talk about the gap we see in students with some of these from COVID. It's little things like the things that were TIFs in middle school are now things in high school because they missed those years. So yeah, this is a big one for us.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Liz. It's true. And again, we don't want to, we typically will leverage what we call the ladder of inference in this process, which is, are we making assumptions too quickly about what we're seeing? And it's the concept of taking that objective data and then reframing it and climbing up towards those beliefs and assumptions and actions that we're going to take. And so again, whenever we're thinking about what it is that a student is demonstrating, having these competencies to frame what it is that we want them to do from an asset-based perspective is so crucial. It's so crucial because it's not that we want them to stop yelling. It's what do we want them to be doing in place of that from that asset-based perspective. And when we teach these pragmatic social skills, when we teach all these things, that is what we're teaching, right? What are those functional skills, those replacement skills that we're able to offer to students in place of these maladaptive, either social or, academic skills that they may be demonstrating because of some of these gaps that we have within the system. And it's okay to acknowledge those gaps. Awesome. All right. Fourth one, relationship skills. So relationship skills is a fun one. I like this one. So, I mean, I like all of them, but I like this one too. So 4A, using positive communication and social skills to interact effectively with others. 4B is developing and maintaining positive relationships, and 4C is demonstrating an ability to prevent, manage, and or resolve interpersonal conflicts in constructive ways. At this point, you may be noticing patterns and trends in what it is that we're talking about. That will continue through this process, I'm sure. Of course, we're going to focus on 4A, which is using positive communication and social skills to interact effectively with others. So again, what does that look like? What does that help students do? Well, students may be able to practice active listening so frequently. I know that I'm engaged in a conversation with one of my kids, and I know that they are just waiting for their turn to talk. I also know that in those conversations, I very frequently am waiting for my turn to talk because air is at a premium in a lot of our conversations. You got to seize that dead air when it comes. And so I say that to the point of the active listening process is a lot of times something that needs to be explicitly informed through modeling, right? And we'll talk about, again, what does that look like for parents? How can we support that? But we can't just assume that active listening is something that is going to exist in an interpersonal relationship. They're listening for purpose and for function to be able to inform what our thoughts are, to be able to help us refine what our interpretations are of that other person's ideas and perspectives, to validate them, to construct more empathy in the service of developing these relationships more authentically. Using polite language and showing respect. This is something that sometimes gets lost, especially with us as adults. I think that one of the things that, we have unfortunately developed is kind of the process of being able to kind of stop video, but in real life, you pick up the phone or something like that. And sometimes that's just our version of stop video. And so a lot of times what we may, in varying instances, want to be able to support our students in is both the polite language and what it is that respect looks like within a specific situation. Respect is a word that can get scary sometimes because what might be respect to one person or in one context is completely different than what respect looks like in another context. And a lot of times when power dynamics come into play, it can get a little bit, things can again get a little bit scary because we really want to make sure that there is common language for what it is that mutual respect looks like. And I think that that's the key way to think about this, is not just what is one person doing, but how is mutual respect, or what we might say adherence to common values, what does that look like within a specific context and environment? And then working effectively in team and group settings. And I think that that is, again, a great way for us to be able to operationalize that respect. What is it that we're doing in a group setting that shows that we are able to both care for ourselves and others, to be able to work towards mutual outcomes, to be able to be effective both within our role and as a part of an overall team? And then again, thinking how parents can help. Very simple ways. Providing opportunities to practice social skills is vitally important. That can be both with same age peers, it can be with adults, it can be with family members, it can be informal, it can be formal, probably better informal, honestly. But then modeling positive communication, social interactions. Again, what is our method for using polite language and showing respect for one another? What is our way of effectively working in team and group settings? How effectively are we actively listening in these processes? And then again, teaching and reinforcing that polite language, active listening, and respectful behavior. Anything else that anybody would add to this? These relationship skills, I think they touch on a lot of the main points that we've hit on earlier today. Anything anybody would add? All right. And at 12:49, we're going to hit our fifth competency and maybe get out of here just a little bit early. So our fifth competency is responsible decision making. So responsible decision making in a lot of instances is that overall outcome. We've hit self-awareness and self-management, those internalizations. We've hit social awareness and relationship skills, which are kind of those externalizations. Responsible decision making, in my opinion, again, it comes at the end, but it's kind of that encapsulation of both the internal and externalization of this whole process. But it's the consideration and use of multiple factors in decision-making, including ethical and safety factors, personal and community responsibilities, and short and long-term goals. Basically a lot, weighing a lot of factors in decision-making. And then 5B is what is that structure for that? So the development, implementation, and modeling of effective decision-making skills to deal responsibly with academic and social situations. So the first one is what an effective decision-making process looks like. And the second is how is that systematically applied across decisions that are being made in one's life. So of course, we're going to focus on 5A, responsible decision making. How are we using strategies for, hang on. No, that wasn't right. So we're gonna focus in on 5A without going to the next slide because it looks like it didn't update. So I apologize for that. But we're gonna consider this. How is it that we are able to weigh in on what these processes look like? So how do we take all of these together? And you know what? I think this is kind of perfect because I'm gonna invite everybody in the room to talk about maybe what this might look like for a child, for a student, for a learner. I think I'll leave that as the first question. What would this look like? This specific standard and competency. What would that look like for a learner? What would we want to see from a learner in an ideal situation if they are internalizing and demonstrating proficiency in this area? You can either put it in the chat or unmute.
With some of the students that we help out, a lot of them are children that come from problematic households or homelessness or drug abuse. So I think too, for us, it's one of those things that with the students that we help out, you know, having the students choose more ethical choices than what they're being shown at their household, what they're around, and then, you know, and reinforcing those good decisions that they're making.
I appreciate that, Ennio, and that's fantastic. You know, given the context and the circumstances, and we always, the way that we frame growth, especially with regards to IEPs, basically, is what is a reasonable consideration in light of a student's unique circumstances, right? And so that I think is important and crucial in this, is that growth is not always, again, what is necessarily, you know, weighted against same age peers. That's, you know, what we call norm referenced, right? But also what is the student's growth compared to where they were, you know, a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, right? What is that rate of improvement for that student, right? Because again, that's going to give us our celebrations. That's going to give us those opportunities to really capitalize on what we're trying to promote.
America strong. The family.
So does anybody else have any ideas on how this might be, use the term operationalized, or what it might look like for a student?
I mean, in the world that I work in with students with autism, I would use a visual with a student, and we would actually kind of help them make a chart like this that would have, you know, things that they might want to consider as they're going through it, sort of checklists in each categories, and then, you know, kind of laying it out graphically for them. So that's sort of how I would envision it in our world.
I love that. I love a good decision tree. It always makes everything a little bit more coherent, right? And Liz, I think your way of thinking on this is, it's hitting on a fine point, because what you've essentially done is you've taken something that is incredibly, remarkably abstract in terms of what decision making is, and you've made it concrete. And that is, and my colleagues can correct me on this, I think a skill that is incredibly necessary in the environments and context within which we teach and live, obviously, as it applies to parents. But taking something that is big and broad and making it bite size, I think is a skill that, you know, is really going to support this process.
I'm glad that you mentioned the population that you work with, Liz, because SEL, mental health, looks different with different populations. And with kids with autism, it's like Mac was just saying, it's so broad and abstract. And there are a lot of SEL curriculums that use broad and abstract terms. My favorite one is sharpen the saw. I'm always thinking of, and I'm not trying to call out any specific curriculums or anything, but if I have a kid who has autism, they're literally thinking of sharpening a saw. What does that even mean? So, you know, those concrete examples, wherever possible, are just so important. I'm sure you have all kinds of ways to adapt these abstract lessons into ways that make more sense and be such a supportive educator.
Thank you. I appreciate that. No, it's something we struggle with too. And like you said, it's different with each student. And the fact that students with autism just generally struggle so much more with abstract concepts puts us sort of at a different vantage point. So I'm really happy to be here today and kind of see it from outside of the autism world and think about it in other ways too.
It's great having you here for it, and we really appreciate it. Anybody else have any thoughts about this? Awesome. Well, I won't keep you too long. Some of the things that we want to highlight that are specific performance indicators that we have in this, how is it that students are able to identify and illustrate safe and unsafe situations, recognizing that one has choices in how to respond in a situation, and that all choices have consequences, and knowing the difference between strangers, acquaintances, and friends. Again, these are all things that are very concrete. And I think within this process, one of the methods that is going to be prioritized, I think that should be prioritized in this process, is how can you take these abstract ideas and make them concrete? And I think that will help support exactly what it is that we're working on. So some specific SEL data that may manifest in the IEP. I'm not necessarily saying that it's going to be in all these areas, but it could be in several of these areas. What does progress look like for students' instructional goals? What does progress look like on the students' IEP goals, right? So their classroom goals, formative, summative, tests, quizzes, homework, but then also their IEP goals. And then what does it look like on their teacher, parent, and student feedback forms? And then again, we've also talked about this, what are the different processes, assessment, and data sources that might be able to show growth in specific areas? And how have students been responding to tiered assessments that show those instructional growth areas? So I think these are all areas that you can hone in on. With that, I was just curious, if you have, or if anybody in the room has, one tomorrow takeaway. So one thing that I will tomorrow start doing with this new information that I have.
Okay, I'll go. I loved how you said we're going to take a look at kids with an asset-based perspective when you were talking about that. And I think that is it's a different way than I've ever heard it presented before when we're talking about social skills and things like that. And I really liked it. So that's definitely something I'm going to bring along when I talk about that to teams.
Thank you. And again, it's, just to reflect on that, it's so vitally important that we frame these skills to students as assets, because that's what they are. These skills are assets. It's not a dearth of ability or an absence of ability. When they are able to improve, that's a celebration. It's growth in an asset, in a skill area. And that's something that should be celebrated. And it's something that should be effectively modeled across different contexts. And so I'm glad that that was a takeaway for you. Anybody else have a tomorrow takeaway? It's okay if you don't.
I just want to say I'm going to probably try more of positive behavior modeling as my way of reinforcing how my son should be in his behaviors. He has a high impulsivity, so he doesn't think first a lot of times. So that's the thing I have to try and show the pros and cons of what does happen.
As somebody who also has impulsive children, I empathize very much with that struggle. And it's tough because that lack of forethought is the thing that you're trying to capture the most in terms of bringing it to your child's attention, I'm sure. But
Yeah.
it's that lack of forethought that prevents your child perhaps from being able to think ahead of time, oh, this is perhaps something that is, a reaction to an external or internal stimulus or whatever it may be.
Mhm. Yeah, and wanting him to maybe try some things more independently, some things I think he could do that he actually still needs me to be there to say, no, no, do it this way, not that way.
Everybody needs a champion, and you are clearly your child's champion, so I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Awesome. NEO, that's awesome. I'm going to read it out loud. Outlook on celebration, making that a benchmark activity for each level of growth is something I'll take away. Celebrating growth in each point helps us to celebrate how in correlation with the students where they are in awareness and management. Absolutely. It's so important to benchmark a point in time. And I think that that is what that celebration helps us do. So it's 101. I appreciate everybody being here today. I want to hold that time for you. This is my contact information. The session is recorded, so anybody who would like to revisit it, you have an opportunity to. Mary, I will send it to you. Thanks, everybody.